Welcome to another PureRead audiobook. It's wonderful to have you with us. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple and easy way ensures we can continue adding more delightful audiobooks for your listening enjoyment. The following story is copyrighted PureRead Limited, the home of books you can trust. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Miriam's Miracle Child, an Amish Romance by Grace Given. Chapter 1. Prologue. Well, how many would you like to have? Mother asked while a gentle smile crossed her face. 6-year-old Joseph blinked his eyes. He had never considered that question and thought for a while. Then his eyes lit up, and while he tightened his fists, he answered, 9. His brother Jonathan guffawed. 9. That's way too many. You'll never do anything but change diapers and be worried sick when your kids have the flu. Joseph shrugged his shoulders. Even though Jonathan was 3 years older and knew almost everything there was to know, this time he was wrong. Having children is nice. I want a big family. Jonathan shook his head. You are just too young to know what's gut for you. That's just dumb. Quiet, Jonathan, Mother ordered. That's not dumb at all. Mother pointed to the Bible and said, Children are a gift of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is a reward. Imagine Dad and I would have only given birth to your sister Abigail, because we were worried about changing too many diapers. You wouldn't even be here today. Jonathan pressed his lips together. Guess so. But when I am older, I don't want 9 children. Well, I do, said Joseph while he glared at his brother with his dark brown eyes. They had just returned from a visit to the farm of their oldest sister Abigail, who was married to Abe Schwarzentruber, and she had given birth to her first addition to the flourishing Amish community. Joseph had been staring in awe at the child in Abigail's arms. Soft and perfect, the tiny fingers and arms looked so tender and frail that Joseph didn't dare touch that beautiful child with his clumsy fingers. Don't worry, Joseph, Abigail smiled. She lifted the bundle up. He blushed. No, yes, but will I harm the baby? Of course not, silly, Jonathan had smirked. Babies don't just fall apart. Mother had taken little Anna out of Abigail's hands and gently placed her on Joseph's lap. Joseph held on to the package for dear life, and when he smelled the fresh baby scent and saw Anna staring at him with these little blue pearls of hers, he was sold. Anna wriggled one of her little hands in his direction and touched his face. A lump formed in Joseph's throat. He was beholding a miracle, and for the first time in his life, he knew with great clarity that he wanted children of his own. Anna stayed on his lap for a long time, but when she started to whimper, Abigail took her back and smiled. She needs to nurse. She needs to nurse. She then removed some straight pins from her dress and stuck them in her cap so they wouldn't hurt the baby and exposed her breast very discreetly to Anna. Even though there was hardly anything to see, Jonathan blurted out, Can we go home now, ma'am? Joseph was very quiet on the way back as he pondered Anna's beautiful face, and his head was full of questions. How did it all work? How did Anna actually get here? And now, an hour later, he was still thinking about it. He and Jonathan were slurping down hot chocolate milk at the kitchen table. Joseph was pursing his lips and blowing hard over the steaming cup of brown liquid. He loved chocolate milk and hardly had the patience to wait for it to cool down enough to drink. Patience was a virtue he did not yet possess. Ma'am, he asked. Yes, Joseph. I want children too. And so he announced his plans for 9 children. Just start with one, Joseph, Mother chuckled. You can only get one at a time, so you'll need a bit of patience first. Yeah, Jonathan sneered. And you need a wife, too. A wife. That was something Joseph had forgotten, but that was easy. He already had one. I already have a wife, Joseph announced. Jonathan burst out laughing. And who might that be? Joseph stared for a moment at his brother. Sometimes he really wondered about Jonathan. That'd be Miriam, of course. Mother had a twinkle in her eyes. I am very happy you two like each other so much, Joseph, but she's still a bit young. Ja, added Jonathan, while he rubbed his nose. She's not even 5 years old. So, Joseph felt his face flush. Well, Mother said, maybe in a few years you think differently. One day you may meet a pretty girl, and as you look at her, she takes your breath away. Your heart starts to pound, you sweat, and you have butterflies in your stomach. When that happens, you have found your wife? Joseph squinted his eyes. That sounded weird. He didn't like sweating, and he certainly didn't need butterflies in his stomach. I like Miriam, ma'am. Can she be my wife, even if I do not sweat? Mother ruffled his blonde hair. Sure, Joseph. Don't worry about it. Someday you'll understand. Joseph nodded, but he wanted someday to be today. He thought for a moment and then said with a satisfied sigh, Ja, when Miriam and I are married, I will have 9 children. It seemed like a good plan. Then he looked up. But how do we get children, ma'am? Jonathan wrinkled his nose. Archie Miller told me how it works. He said that, but Mother cut him off. Hold your tongue, Jonathan. And you, Joseph, don't worry about it. When the time is ripe, you will understand it. Maybe Dadette can talk to you about that someday. Again, those words, someday. Joseph sighed. He had not realized that life could be so complicated. Some women can't get any children, Jonathan piped up. Archie Miller was telling me that some girls are defibrillated. Mother frowned. What are you talking about, Jonathan? That's not a proper word. Maybe you mean debilitated, but you probably mean that some women are unfruitful, like Hannah in the Bible before she got Samuel. Ja, Jonathan answered. That's what I mean. Whoa, what's that, Mom? Joseph asked while his eyes grew wide. For some women, it's hard to get children. But then, like Hannah, they pray, and then they do get children, so it all works out in the end. Joseph frowned. That seemed difficult. Pshaw! Jonathan sneered. Archmill. Mother glared at Jonathan. Watch your mouth, young man, or I will wash it with soap. Ja, Mom. Sorry. Joseph finished his chocolate milk and licked his lips. All this talk about babies, butterflies, and defibrillated girls cast a bit of a shadow over this beautiful day. It scared him, and he secretly prayed that he still would get lots of children, but that it wouldn't be difficult to get them. For that he wanted children was certain, and Miriam was going to be the mother. Chapter 2. Roll away the stone. Faith is the pencil of the soul that sketches heavenly things. The service was packed that Sunday morning, and Joseph listened to the sermon of Bishop Hostetler with bated breath. And it was then, the bishop said with booming voice, that Jesus said, "Take ye away the stone." The bishop, with his long, flowing beard, had always been a capable speaker, but today's message was extraordinary. It seemed to be written directly for Joseph himself. The words inspired him and spoke directly to his heart. The people next to Joseph seemed pleased, as well as they nodded their heads in agreement. Joseph looked up into the searching eyes of the deacon and let the words feed his hungry soul. "You do what you can do, and then God will do what you can't." The bishop went on. "Living by faith means putting faith into action and feet to your prayers. That's why Jesus didn't want to roll the stone away. That was something the people could do for themselves." Bishop Hostetler paused for a moment to accentuate the importance of his statement, and as he cleared his throat, he studied the faces of the people before him. He was talking about the time that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead and had ordered the people to roll away the stone in front of the grave. "And that," he said while he leaned forward, "is the way God always works. You do what you can do, and then God will do what you can't. We need to make room for the miracle and roll away the stone, and only then will God perform the miracle." Miracles. That's what Joseph and Miriam needed. He glanced at Miriam as she was sitting in the women's section of the meeting place. Her misty blue eyes were closed, and she too seemed to be pondering the words of the bishop. Her slender fingers were folded in her lap, and her long, golden blonde hair was skillfully put away under what she referred to as her Sunday cap. Miriam had been his delight for as long as he could remember. There had never been any doubt in Joseph's mind as to who he was supposed to marry. Like him, she was a serious seeker of the plain life. They were made for each other, and their way had been clear from the beginning. For them, there had never been a need for rumspringa. They did not need a time to try out the world. Like his brother Jonathan, who left the community 2 years ago and was now taking a walk on the wild side with some girl he had met somewhere in town. The day he had left, he had broken all of their hearts. Joseph still shivered as he thought about it. "Don't weep for me, little brother," Jonathan had smiled. "I hope you're going to be happy with your Miriam. But this life," he looked around and wrinkled his nose, "is not for me. They hardly ever saw him, but maybe that was for the better. After all, he who runs with the wolves learns to howl, and Joseph preferred to keep his brother's worldly attitudes as far away from his life as possible. Why anybody would turn his back on the simple life was beyond him. Jonathan was obviously on the downgrade, but he and Miriam would stay faithful. All he wanted was to serve God and be a blessing to the community, and he never regretted his choice for the plain and righteous life. God was good, and to Joseph, it almost looked like Miriam was growing sweeter and more beautiful by the day. Only one thing was missing. One thing was casting a shadow over their happy lives. They had no children. At first, Joseph had pushed it out of his mind, thinking God would bless them over time. But that didn't happen. God didn't bless them with a child, and it bothered him. Sometimes, when he couldn't sleep and was staring into the dark, he felt overwhelmed. He wanted to have a happy family, full of lively children that they could raise in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Why didn't God bless them in that way? Joseph secretly thought it was because of Miriam. He never told her, but suspected she was barren. How else was it possible that they weren't getting a child? When they married 2 years ago and promised each other to be faithful unto death, they had read the beautiful promise in God's Word about children and claimed it for their own future. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed. But there were no arrows in Joseph's hand, and his quiver was empty, and although Miriam was positive and full of faith, Joseph had started to question God. The bishop had told Joseph to have faith, Maybe God is testing your faith, Joseph. Are you willing to believe Gott no matter what? So many people hang their faith on whether or not it gives them what they want. But that's not how faith works. Joseph had listened. Deep inside, he knew the bishop was right. Faith worked on trust and had nothing to do with sight. But still, he didn't like those words and had secretly shrugged his shoulders. It was easy for the bishop to say that. After all, the man had 7 children himself. Words were easily spoken, but didn't take the pain away. No, it just wasn't right, and that's why they needed a miracle. But now the words that the bishop spoke gave Joseph hope. Raising Lazarus from the dead was a lot more difficult than overcoming Miriam's barrenness. Imagine that Lazarus had been dead for 4 days already. Getting Miriam pregnant was a piece of cake for God. And so, as he was listening to the sermon, an idea formed in Joseph's mind. What if he would prepare his quiver? He was a skilled carpenter and had learned the trade from his father. What if he would step out by faith and build a children's room on their farm, even though there was no baby yet? It would show God they meant business, and that would please him. The room would have to be spacious and beautiful, full of light, and its windows would look out over the cornfields. Everything would be made of the finest wood, and in the corner he would build a lovely baby bed and a big easy chair for Miriam. She could sit there and nurse their child. When he closed his eyes and beheld his vision, joy was bubbling up from deep within. Miriam would be so happy. They would make room for the miracle and God would answer. It was the same as the rolling away of the stone in the story of Lazarus. He would do what he could do, and then God would do what he couldn't. Without realizing it, he let out a joyful chuckle. It startled the congregation, and Bishop Hostetler narrowed his eyes as he beheld Joseph. Joseph's ears turned red and he stammered an apology. But inside he was rejoicing. Miriam would become pregnant. Chapter 3. A Deal with Gott. True patience means waiting without worrying. You are going to love it, Miriam. Joseph was gently squeezing Miriam's hand as he unfolded his plans for the new room. They sat on the wooden bench outside their house and were enjoying the balmy evening air while the sun was slowly sinking behind the horizon. Joseph was lounging with his shoulders against the farmhouse and smiled. They often sat here and quietly basked in each other's presence. But today, Joseph wanted more than just sit together. He was full of his vision and wanted to talk about it. It's going to be the best thing I've ever built. And then he kissed Miriam's forehead. You will get pregnant. Joseph's eyes shone with excitement. Miriam glanced up at her husband. It's a beautiful vision, Joseph. I sure hope you are right. Of course I'm right, Joseph snorted. God is going to do it. Miriam lowered her eyes. Joseph frowned. Aren't you happy? Miriam reached for Joseph's beard and started to gently caress it. I love you, Joseph. You are a wonderful man. But what if I don't get pregnant? Joseph raised his eyebrows. What? Of course you're going to get pregnant. It's like rolling away the stone. I told you. Miriam leaned forward and nestled her head against Joseph's chest. I understand what you're saying, Joseph. But it just sounds so, well, I'm not sure if we can make such deals with God. How's that? Joseph asked while he cleared his throat. Well, it's like saying, God, I do this, and because I've done this. You need to do that. Miriam looked up. I want a baby too, Joseph. It would make me so happy. Her eyes were glistening as she spoke. I believe in miracles, Joseph, but I'm just not sure if this is the way." Joseph stiffened. He had expected that Miriam would be delighted and would share his vision. Sometimes Miriam spoke while she held his hand. "We long so much for something that we make deals with Gott and end up leaning on the arm of the flesh in order to get it." A deal with Gott? The arm of the flesh? What's she talking about? Joseph tapped his foot. "I am not making deals with Gott. I am just rolling away the stone. Why couldn't Miriam see that he was having great faith? And why was she manifesting such a lack of faith?" Miriam took Joseph's hat off his head and started to ruffle his hair, but Joseph barely noticed it as a thought hit him. Of course, it's because she's barren. He had heard before how women that are unfruitful would often fall prey to depressions, doubts, and terrible fears. It made sense. This confirmed it. He placed a gentle kiss on Miriam's head as she was still leaning against his chest. It must be hard for Miriam to have to deal with such emotions, but he had to be strong. He had to be strong. He had to be strong for her, and it was up to him to carve out their future. He had to stay on course. "I am going to build the baby room anyway," he announced. "I am starting today, and every day after I am done with my other work, I'll work on it." Miriam nodded. "I love you, Joseph. I will support you in the decisions you make. I just hope you are right." Joseph smiled. "Of course, Miriam, but don't you worry. It's all going to work out fine." 3 months later, the room was finished. Joseph had carefully drawn up the plans, collected all the necessary building materials, and at the appointed day several members of the community had come, and the room had been erected in no time. Joseph was tickled pink. The end result was even better than he had hoped for, and as he led Miriam through the adjoining door from the living room into the bright, sunlit room, his face was beaming. Miriam breathed in the scent of the fresh pine wood and let her fingers slide over the window panes. Her face flushed. "You are a real craftsman, Joseph," she said. "It's truly the best baby room I have ever seen." "I know." And now he said while he raised one finger in the air, "God's going to do his part. You are going to get pregnant. God is going to overrule any physical limitations." Miriam raised her eyebrows. "What do you mean, physical limitations?" "Nothing," Joseph shrugged. "I just mean that we made the way. God's going to do the rest." Miriam sighed. "I sure hope so." "Of course, Miriam." Joseph chuckled to himself, and in his mind's eye he could already see several babies crawling over the varnished floor. "If we are going to get a boy, we call him Jacob, and if it's a girl, it will be Miriam," Joseph said while he kissed Miriam on her forehead. He understood that it wasn't easy for Miriam to have faith. Happily, soon her cross would be lifted. But nothing happened. The cross wasn't lifted, and Miriam did not get pregnant. The baby room stayed empty. Joseph had constructed a beautiful crib, but the only one who was using it was Ginger, their tabby cat. "I don't understand." Joseph broached the subject one afternoon during lunch. His shoulders were drooping, and he looked like a puppy dog that had gotten a beating. "I thought you'd surely be pregnant by now. We've had this baby room for almost a year, and nothing happened." He picked up a slice of their homemade bread, but tossed it back on the cutting board while he shook his head. "Don't be discouraged, my love." Miriam reached out for him, but Joseph pulled away. "It's just not right," he mumbled. "I've done all I could." "We can't always understand the ways of God," Miriam began. "He's so much bigger than we are. We sometimes presume to understand, but we don't. It's our job, just to trust. Joseph pressed his lips together and scowled. I've rolled the stone away. I've done my part. We have prayed, we waited for the right days, and I made a beautiful baby room. And still Gott isn't answering. Miriam sank back on her chair. Joseph, don't talk like that. Who are we to question Gott? You just sound like the bishop, Joseph fired back. Miriam looked up and shook her head. Then she muttered, Joseph Byler, stop talking like that. Why? Joseph glared. It's the truth, isn't it? Miriam got up and walked over to him. When she stood before him, she planted her arms firmly in her sides. You are just discouraged, Joseph. But the voice of doubt doesn't yield happiness. You need to snap out of it. I love you, but I don't want to hear you talk like this. Joseph's eyes widened in surprise. He had never seen Miriam like this. He stared at the ground and played with his fingers for a while. Then he looked up and said, Miriam. Yes, Joseph. I think we need to see a doctor. Maybe a doctor can help. Whoa, what? What are you talking about? Miriam stepped back. Joseph sucked in his lips. How could he gently approach this difficult subject? Well, did you ever consider, Consider what? Miriam's voice sounded cold. Well, it happened in the Bible too. Sometimes women are, barren. Miriam blinked and her eyes held an empty stare. Then she shook her head and sank down on her chair again. Even if that would be the case, Joseph, you really think a pill from the Englishers will help? Joseph tried to read her thoughts, but he couldn't quite place the expression in her eyes. Maybe? What makes you think I am barren? Her voice was soft and barely audible. Well, no, but we have no children. That's proof enough. Miriam stared for a while at a piece of the Amish friendship bread on her plate. Then a gentle expression covered her face. We may not have any children, Joseph. We may not have any children, Joseph. We have each other and we have Gott. Isn't that enough reason to be grateful? No, Miriam. It isn't. Joseph spouted it out. We just haven't rolled the right stone away. Joseph walked over to Miriam and knelt before her on the ground. As he placed his hands in her lap, he gazed deeply into her eyes. Let's see a doctor, Miriam. There's no shame in going to a doctor. Maybe there is something that can be done. Miriam sighed. If you insist, Joseph, I want children too, but I just don't want it to become an issue between Gott and us. It won't, Joseph said. I didn't build that baby room for nothing. It needs to be filled with the happy chatter of children, not with the purring of a cat. He had to chuckle when he said it. The doctor would help. Chapter 4. Never. Faith ends where worry begins, and worry ends where faith begins. Dr. Al Morris readjusted the thick glasses on his bony nose and studied the papers on his shiny desk that was adorned by a plastic statue of a man that was gazing heavenward. It revealed all the man's muscles and veins, and Joseph stared at it for a few seconds. Did he look like that too? He shivered and focused on Dr. Morris' face. He was an older man and radiated with professional trustworthiness. Dr. Morris cleared his throat and looked up in the expecting eyes of Joseph and Miriam Byler. Then he looked down again on his papers and rubbed the bald spot on his head. Nothing, he mumbled. Nothing what, doctor? Joseph ventured. What's the problem? Dr. Morris looked up again and sucked in his cheeks. "There's nothing wrong with Mrs. Byler." There appeared a smile on his mature and seasoned face. "I suppose that it is good news, then." "Nothing wrong." Joseph repeated the words of the doctor. "But why can't we get any children, then?" Dr. Morris readjusted his glasses again. "I wouldn't be able to tell you that, Mr. Byler. Are you under a lot of stress?" Stress? That was ridiculous. "No, doctor. We are Amish. We have no stress." "Oh, I see." Dr. Al Morris answered while he raised his eyebrows. "In any case, your wife is perfectly able to produce a child. She is in no way barren or unfruitful." Miriam heaved a sigh of relief. "Of course," Dr. Morris went on, "there's one other possibility." "What's that, doctor?" Joseph wanted to know. "Well, started the doctor, can we test you too, Mr. Byler?" "Me?" Joseph fell back on his chair. "Well, it's a possibility, isn't it? I am not saying the problem is with you, but if we don't test, we will never know." "But why would I be—" "Well," Dr. Morris smiled. "It's nothing to be ashamed of, Mr. Byler. It happens to the best of us." Joseph swallowed and looked at Miriam. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Miriam sucked in her lips. "Well, you wanted to go to the doctor. Here we are. Go for it?" Joseph swallowed. "All right, doctor. I am all yours." A week later, Miriam and Joseph were back in Dr. Morris's waiting room. The secretary cast them a friendly smile and ordered them to sit down. "Dr. Morris will be with you shortly." Joseph was biting his nails and stared at the cover of an issue of American Farmer's Magazine that was on top of a stack of well-thumbed magazines. He felt tempted to pick it up, but as he glanced at Miriam, who was sitting straight beside him, it just didn't seem to be the right thing to do. Then the door opened and Dr. Morris came out. "Joseph and Miriam Byler, please come in." He opened the door and extended his hand. When Joseph and Miriam were sitting again in front of him, Dr. Morris made a little pyramid with his fingers and stared at Joseph with a serious look. Joseph shifted on his chair and looked past the doctor through the window at some sparrows that were soaring high in the sky. Dr. Morris coughed. "Well, the tests are done And?" Miriam asked. Dr. Morris rubbed his bald spot again and blinked his eyes. "Mr. Byler?" "Yes, doctor." "Well, the tests are conclusive." Miriam squeezed Joseph's hand. "And?" "I am really sorry, Mr. Byler, but you will never be able to produce any children." It was already dark when they went home. As they left the city, and Joseph was guiding the buggy through the fields, neither of them spoke. Miriam was holding Joseph's hand. At first he had tried to shake it off, but she just wouldn't let go, and admittedly, the warmth of her hand felt good. The news had hit him hard. How was it possible? He had always been healthy. He had not ever considered the possibility that he was the one that could never get any children. Never. What a terrible word. It was a word without hope. In one sharp moment of bitter pain, his dream had exploded into thin air. His whole baby room had been a mistake, and there were never going to be any children to fill up the room. As he glanced at Miriam, he felt so small. The word unworthy kept ringing through his head. He was unworthy, unworthy, unworthy of Gott, and unworthy of Gott, and unworthy of such a beautiful woman. But Miriam looked unshaken. She still radiated peace, even now. She had smiled at the doctor when they had left the office and thanked him. Not Joseph. He had wanted to kick the man. As they strode by the secretary on their way out, she had looked at them with her silly big eyes. Did she know? But Miriam was peaceful. She was strong. When they came outside, she kissed Joseph and held his hand. "I love you, Joseph Byler," she had said. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, and I thank Gott for you every day." How could she say such a thing? He was a loser. He had even complained to God that Miriam had so little faith, but now he was the one with the little faith. A big tear welled up out of Joseph's eye and dropped on Miriam's hand. She squeezed closer to Joseph and rested her head on his arm. Then she started to softly sing with that beautiful voice of hers. Joseph couldn't hold it back any longer, and the tears were flowing freely as Miriam's melodious voice cut through the evening air. How did she know to sing this very hymn? Unworthy am I of the grace that he gave, unworthy to hold to his hand, amazed that a king reached down to a slave. This love I cannot understand. Unworthy, a beggar, in bondage and alone? But he made me worthy, and now by his grace, his mercy has made me his own. Chapter 5. Hochmut. If you would be a lion in God's cause, you must be a lamb in your own. When Joseph opened the front door to their farm and stepped inside, he had expected to see Miriam in the kitchen. He was longing to see her gentle face and her mysterious, soft blue eyes that radiated so much faith and strength. He was tired and needed her strength now, more than ever. He wanted to hold her hand and rest his weary body next to hers. But where was she? He had picked up a bouquet of chocolate daisies, Miriam's favorite wildflower, and placed it on the kitchen table. Its heavenly cocoa-licious scent wafted through the kitchen. He stepped into the hallway and noticed that the door to their bedroom was open. Then he heard Miriam. Was she crying? He put his hand on the door and gave the wood a soft push. A wide crack appeared and Joseph peeked in. Miriam was on her knees in front of the bed with her back turned to the door. She had her face lifted to the heavens while her folded hands rested on the bed before her. For a moment, Joseph stood frozen as he listened to her indistinct but passionate mumbling and an occasional sob. He bit his lip. He had no business here and wanted to turn. This was Miriam's private time with the Creator. Careful as to not make sound, he stepped back. The floor creaked, and Joseph stopped, but Miriam had not heard it and went on praying. Just then, he heard her whisper his name. He stopped again and listened. Was she praying for him? "Oh God, please help my beloved Joseph. I know you are teaching us deep lessons of faith, and for that I am grateful. But strengthen Joseph. He so easily doubts you. God grant him the faith to make it through this valley. We both need you, Father. Very strong either. But you know I will yield to your every decision. I will not be rebellious and will serve you no matter what happens. But like Hannah of old, I plead with you for a child. Help us and especially help Joseph, Father." The floor creaked again. Joseph pulled his body back into the hallway and tiptoed back to the kitchen. They had prayed for a child before, and God had not answered. Why would God answer now? He was infertile, and it was hopeless. He pulled out a chair and sank down. And what was it that Miriam had prayed? But strengthen Joseph. He so easily doubts you, Gott. Was that true? Did he doubt God? He clenched his teeth. He was supposed to be strong. He was the man in the house, the leader of the family. Tears stung his eyes again. Maybe he needed to see his brother Jonathan in town and... Are these for me? Miriam's sweet voice cut through his gloomy thoughts as she walked into the kitchen and picked up the chocolate daisies. She walked over to Joseph, placed a kiss on his cheek, and put her nose into the flowers. "It's the scent of heaven," she continued. "In heaven, I am going to ask God to put our house in a field of chocolate daisies." How can she be so happy? Miriam glanced at him and said with a twinkle in her eyes, "Have I ever told you that I love you?" Joseph just nodded and stared at the ground. "Joseph," Miriam walked over to where Joseph sat slouching on the chair and knelt before him. "I really, really love you. We've got Gott and we've got each other." She stared deep into Joseph's eyes. "We've got all we need." But Joseph let out a deep sigh and got up. He did not let her finish and said, "I need to finish the table for Abe Zook. I will be in the workshop." Then he stomped out of the kitchen and left Miriam behind. Bishop Hostetler's eyes filled with compassion as he looked at the heap of discouragement before him. Joseph had come for counsel and was seated opposite the table in the bishop's living room. He had never seen Joseph like this, and secretly prayed that God would give him the words that Joseph needed to hear. "This is God's way of making you strong, Joseph." He reached out his hand and placed it on Joseph's shoulders. "You are a gut man, but your faith has never been tested yet." "What do you mean?" Joseph mumbled while he fidgeted with his fingers. "Why does my faith need to be tested?" For an instant, the bishop had to smile. Joseph almost sounded like a wronged child, and that was precisely why his faith needed to be strengthened. But how could he share that message with Joseph? "You never had to weather the storms of life, Joseph. Your life has always been smooth and wonderful, but as a result, your faith is not yet as strong as it should be." "I don't understand," Joseph complained. "What does that have to do with the fact that I can't get any children?" The bishop thought for a moment. "There once was a man who asked a boy to go with him into the woods to cut down some trees to use the wood for axe handles. They needed hickory wood, and soon the young boy spotted some hickory trees near their house and wanted to start cutting. But the older man placed his hand on the young boy's shoulder and told him the tree wasn't a good tree for an axe handle. "The good trees are way up there on the hill," the man said as he pointed to a hill in the distance. "But that's so far," the boy complained. "Why can't we use this wood? It's all the same wood." "Because," the older man said, "the trees here in the valley have not been exposed to the storms and the heavy winds. They have been sheltered and are not strong enough to make tough axe handles. But the trees up there are strong because of the winds they had to endure." Joseph looked up. Desperation was written all over his face as he shook his head. "You mean to tell me God is putting me through this to strengthen me? It feels more like a punishment." The bishop shook his head. "God is not punishing you, Joseph. God is love, but his ways are much higher than our ways." The bishop pressed his lips together. "A lot of people are singing God's praises as long as everything goes right, but then they stop trusting when things go wrong. It's really a subtle form of Hochmut, Joseph." "Hochmut, why?" The bishop lowered his eyes. "Pride can come to us in many forms and disguises, Joseph. But it is often the very thing that stands between God and us, The conquest of human pride is a very difficult battle. Joseph shook his head. I don't know about that, Bishop. I hate Hochmut. I don't think that's my main problem. The bishop glanced at Joseph. God will always deliver Joseph. Only he works according to his plan, not according to yours. I will pray for you. Thank you, Bishop. I suppose I need it, Joseph said as he got up. Miriam is waiting for me. Please come back, Joseph. Whenever you want to talk or pray together. Joseph nodded. I will do that, Bishop. As he closed the door behind him, the bishop shook his head. Lord, help your son, Joseph. Joseph had left as discouraged as he had come in. As he journeyed home, Joseph grimaced at the thought of his own impotence. Gott was to blame for this. After all, he had prayed and even shown his faith, and still Gott had not so much as lifted a finger to help. And then there was Miriam. Her insistence on the fact that Gott was always right seemed nothing more than a pathetic excuse for their plight right now. Joseph was ashamed at the thoughts that were assaulting his mind, but he simply did not have the strength left to combat them. He felt his heart hardening toward all that he formerly loved. The pain of believing them was just an affront to his shameful predicament. Chapter 6. No miracle. Anger is just one letter short of danger. You are what? Joseph stared at Miriam with bulging eyes. Miriam was radiant. She was dancing around and couldn't seem to contain her joy. Yes, Joseph, it has happened. God has done the miracle. She ran to Joseph and threw her arms around his neck. He's done it, Joseph. He's done it. Then she quoted the words that Hannah had spoken in the Bible when the Lord had blessed her with the pregnancy of baby Samuel. There is no one holy like the Lord. Indeed, there is no one besides you. Nor is there any rock like our God. But that's not possible, he stammered. I am infertile. Miriam cast him a glorious smile. That's why it's a miracle, Joseph. She lifted her hands to the heavens and praised God. Thank you, Gott. Thank you for answering our prayers. Are you sure? Of course I'm sure, Joseph, Miriam answered. I've done the test 3 times. 3 times? Miriam nodded. Yes, Joseph. We're still going to be able to use the baby room that you have built. The baby room? The room he had built because he thought God would do a miracle for them. Joseph blinked his eyes. But he couldn't get children. Dr. Morris had been certain. Then a dark arrow in the form of an ugly thought pierced his heart. It hit him hard, and he froze. It came out of nowhere, but it had the impact of a cluster bomb. He started to sweat profusely and sank down on a chair. Miriam stopped her praises and glanced at him. What's wrong, Joseph? Joseph looked up at his beloved wife and swallowed excessively. Then a dark scowl appeared. Maybe it was no miracle at all, Miriam. What? Joseph peered at his wife. Maybe you wanted a baby so bad that you... Joseph couldn't say the word, but there was no other explanation. The truth hit him like a millstone. Miriam, his sweet Miriam, had been unfaithful to him. After all, she was perfectly healthy. She could get babies by the dozens. And now that the truth had been established that he was infertile, all of a sudden there was a baby. She had deceived him. She even had the nerve to call it a miracle just so he would accept it. But he wasn't born yesterday. He knew how these things worked. Miriam's face became pale and she swallowed hard as she stared at Joseph with big round eyes. But Joseph, that is utterly ridiculous. I fear Gott and I would never hurt you like that. Joseph sighed. His arms felt heavy and hung limp alongside his body. Why did he feel so tired? A sickening feeling welled up in him. He should not have eaten that bacon this morning. There's no other explanation. Miriam, you have deceived me. His words were dark and cutting. After all, people don't just get pregnant out of thin air. It's not true, Joseph, Miriam said with a sob. Oh, is it? Joseph felt his anger rising. I can't get children, remember, and we haven't even been together for over a month. Yes, we have, Miriam cried. Yes, we have. Her voice started to crack and tears rolled out of her eyes. We have been together. How can you even think such horrible things, Joseph? But Joseph wasn't about to let his unfaithful wife off the hook. No, we haven't been together for ages. I can't even remember the last time. So where does that baby come from? Joseph realized he had raised his voice. That never happened before, but he didn't care. Miriam's shoulders shook as she wept and was breathing heavily. Remember the night after we came back from Dr. Morris, she stuttered. Remember how discouraged you were when we came home? I bathed you, I fed you, and then, well, you know we slept together. Slept together? Joseph shrugged. Since when was Miriam talking like that? But it was true. He had forgotten about that evening. It was so beautiful, Miriam wept. You were so broken up that night. That's the night that God blessed us as a sign of His love. That night, He somehow must have overruled your infertility. That's a horrible word, Joseph yelled. Don't ever use that word again. Miriam gasped. She had never seen Joseph like this. Finally, she stammered, and now you accuse me of being unfaithful to you. She could hardly get the words out in between her sobs. I have never seen you like this. Joseph narrowed his eyes. He could not remember the last time he felt this way. Anger threatened to overtake him. He needed to count to 10 or quote a passage from the Osband. He needed to do something. He needed to get rid of this oppressive feeling. But Miriam's story was like a red flag in front of an unruly bull. Her story was too convenient, too miraculous. Why would God have suddenly healed him? Why would God perform a miracle now when He could have done it so much earlier? Why had God not done it when He had made that baby room? He had worked so hard and prayed so hard for a baby. He had proven His obedience by rolling away the stone, but God had been deaf. No, Miriam had picked out some other man. Probably an Englisher. These folks did not have any morals, and now he had to deal with it. But that wasn't going to happen. There is pride in your heart, Joseph. Miriam sobbed. She gained some control over her emotions and looked at him with drooping eyes. You need to get it sorted out. What? Joseph gave a slow, disbelieving shake with his head. Pride. What are you talking about? I am not the one who's been unfaithful. And neither am I. She flung her weary body on the couch and looked up at the ceiling. Oh, my precious Gott, please help us. There was no more joy on her face. She looked 10 years older, and her eyes that normally sparkled with such strength and peace lay deeply sunken in her face. Neither of them spoke as they stared at the ground. Joseph noticed the anger started to leave his heart, and a whole new range of emotions knocked on his heart's door. It was a mixture of guilt and a fresh new wave of discouragement. Guilt, because he didn't want to be angry at Miriam, and discouragement because he was apparently so weak and useless. He couldn't even rule his own house. It was no wonder that God didn't trust him with children. He took off his hat and brushed his hand over his hair. What could he do now? And now, Miriam? And now what? Well, you have a baby. How do we go on? Miriam stared at Joseph and shook her head. You have a baby too, Joseph. We need to pray and get united before God. Maybe we should seek the bishop's help. I don't want to go to the bishop. Joseph felt new anger rising. He just tells me everything is a test from Gott. Miriam pressed her lips together. We can work it out, Joseph. Joseph shook his head. I don't know, Miriam. I really don't know. Then he got up and put on his coat. I'll be going to town and I will search for my brother Jonathan. I'll be staying with him for a while. What? With Jonathan? And you're leaving me here alone? Miriam's eyes were wide. Yes, with Jonathan. Joseph scowled, only for a few days. I need to think this over. There's enough food in the house. New tears appeared in Miriam's eyes. Oh, Joseph. This should have been one of the best days of our lives. But it became one of the worst. Joseph shrugged his shoulders. I'll see you in a few days. Then he stepped out into the sunlight and closed the door on his unfaithful wife. Chapter 7. A familiar voice. A path with no obstacles is probably a path that doesn't lead anywhere. You had a fight with Miriam. Jonathan's mouth hung open. You know, I am not much of a holy Joe, but if there is anybody I respect, it is Miriam. She's the real thing. What was the fuss all about? Joseph sighed and looked around the small apartment that his brother and his girlfriend Peggy rented. It wasn't much, but Jonathan claimed he was happy, and Peggy, even though she was a chain smoker, seemed nice enough with her happy blonde curls and cheerful countenance. All the furniture had come from the second-hand store, and Joseph noticed several items that needed fixing. But he didn't come to fix his brother's furniture. He didn't even really know why he had come. His brother had served him some tea, but was downing a can of Budweiser himself. Peggy had just come home and was cooking the evening meal in the adjoining kitchen. Joseph took a sip of his tea and put the mug down next to some empty beer cans on the small coffee table. The fuss. Joseph lowered his eyes. She's been unfaithful. Jonathan raised his eyebrows. That's awful, man. With whom? Joseph shrugged his shoulders. Don't know. So how do you know she's been unfaithful? Joseph looked up into his brother's eyes. Remember when we were small and I said I wanted 9 children? Jonathan smiled. Of course, little brother, you were always a little crazy. Joseph didn't smile back. Well, it turns out I can't get 9 children. I can't even get one. I am not fertile, but now Miriam is pregnant. Jonathan blinked his eyes. I see. And now you think she's been with another man? Joseph nodded. Of course, but she claims God has done a miracle. Well, that's possible, isn't it? Peggy hollered from the kitchen as she was stirring in a pot of stew with a big ladle. I mean, you folks are religious enough. Didn't Jesus perform lots of miracles in the Bible? That's my girl. Jonathan smiled. And she's not even Amish. Joseph didn't smile. He hadn't come to discuss miracles. He was tired and worn. Jonathan, can I just stay here for the night? I just need to get my bearings." "Sure," Jonathan said. "You'll have to sleep on the couch, though." "That's fine," Joseph said. "I'll be happy to. But we will first eat some of that delicious stew Peggy made." "And," added Peggy with a smile, "we don't go to bed with the lamb and rise with the lark, like you folks, so you'll have to bear with us for quite a few hours still." Joseph nodded. Life was complicated these days. The gray mist hung over the field, and Joseph shivered as the humid, damp air penetrated his clothes. It was hard to see where he was going, and he had to watch out as he slowly moved forward through the haze. What was he doing here again? He couldn't remember. Oh yes, axe handles. He needed axe handles, lots of them. But he couldn't seem to find the right trees. The bishop had said only hickory trees would make good axe handles. But where could he find hickory trees? Not here. All he could see on the misty plains were ugly, sick-looking fir trees. They were no longer green, but were full of brown spots. It seemed the bugs were feasting on them. They were a sorry sight. Then Joseph cringed. He heard a loud, mocking laugh, and someone screamed, "You'll never get any axe handles, Joseph. You're just too weak." Whose voice was that? It scared Joseph, and he ran wildly through the mist until he spotted a white chapel. Someone was singing a hymn, and he stopped to listen. Laughter in sorrow? Peace in the midst of my storm. Doctor in sickness. And I'm your witness. Show me your will from wrong. You're the potter with clay. Oh, Jesus, please mold me, I pray. He knew that voice. Miriam. Sweet Miriam was inside the chapel, but the door was closed. He couldn't get in. He started to bang on the door. "Miriam, let me in. Open the door." Then there was a voice beside him. "It won't open, Joseph." He turned his head to see who had spoken and spotted Bishop Hostetler. "You've got no axe handles, Joseph," the man said with a scowl. "The chapel only opens if you have axe handles, but you don't have any." "No. God help me." Joseph started to kick and bang on the door. "Let me in." He let out a scream and opened his eyes. What was he doing on the floor? He looked up and spotted his brother and Peggy. "What's wrong, Joseph?" Jonathan asked. Joseph felt the hard wooden floor and saw he was sprawled out on the floor. He had fallen off the couch. I had a dream," Joseph said. "A nightmare?" Peggy asked as she knelt beside him. Joseph nodded and looked up. He shivered. It was all about axe handles. Jonathan frowned. "Go back to sleep, Joseph. It was just a dream. You don't need axe handles. You just need a good sleep." Joseph nodded. He picked up his bedding from the floor and climbed back on the couch. "Good night, Jonathan and Peggy." "Good night, Joseph." Chapter 8, Made by His Mercy. Nature forms us. Sin deforms us. School informs us. But only Christ transforms us. "So what was your dream all about?" Jonathan asked the next morning when they were eating breakfast. He was stirring his cereal with a spoon and glanced at Joseph. "I'm concerned about you, little brother. I may not be Amish anymore, but you're still my brother." Joseph shrugged his shoulders. "In my dream, I needed axe handles, but I couldn't find any." "Axe handles?" Joseph shrugged. "Well, you see, Bishop Hostetler told me that God is testing my faith and told me a story about axe handles. He said that God is often strengthening our faith through trials and tests. I suppose it's why I dreamed about it." "And is he?" Peggy asked. "Is he what?" "Is God strengthening your faith?" Joseph stared in his bowl of milk. "I don't know. Things seemed so easy before. I always thought that when you had a problem, you just needed to pray and then God would take the problem away. But I now realize that it doesn't always work that way." Jonathan smiled. "Well, God does answer prayer, but not always in the way we expect." Joseph stared at his brother. "How's that?" "Well," said Jonathan, "I believe it's the essence of faith to trust even if you don't see the answer. To believe in something means to hold on, even when it isn't easy." He scooped some cereal into his mouth and thought for a moment as he swallowed. "You know, Joseph, a lot of people are singing God's praises as long as everything goes right, but then they stop trusting when things go wrong. If you only believe when things go your way, you are just trying to use Gott. That's not faith." "What?" Joseph's eyes got big as he listened to his brother. "Those were almost the exact same words Bishop Hostetler told me." Jonathan just shrugged his shoulders. "I don't know what he said, but that's what I believe." "But," Joseph asked, "how can you say such things? You are not even Amish." Jonathan started to laugh. "So, does that mean I can't believe in God anymore? I still believe in Him. I just want to be able to listen to the radio too and drink my Budweiser. Now you, on the other hand, want to be more devoted to God, and that's admirable. But God lives in my heart too. He doesn't only live in your community. Lots of Englishers believe in God too." Joseph pursed his lips. "I've never thought about it like that." He always thought that the day Jonathan left their community, he had pretty much committed the unpardonable sin, and God was now wrath with him, as he was with most of the Englishers. But now, after talking to Jonathan, he wasn't so sure if that was true. What actually was the meaning of grace? "Do you love your wife?" Peggy asked. "Of course," Joseph answered without hesitation. "What kind of question is that?" "Well, it seems to me you need to hold on to each other through the hard times, as well as through the good times. What if your wife speaks the truth and she didn't love another man?" "But how can she be pregnant then?" Peggy shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know. I am no doctor, but you claim to believe in God. Who knows how these things work? Your wife is Amish. She wouldn't deliberately deceive you. Isn't it a sin to lie?" Joseph stared in his milk again. "Guess so." Then he looked up. "Miriam is actually a much better person than I am. She's just so kind. And you are accusing her of adultery." Jonathan stepped in. "Come on, Joseph. You're just too proud to admit that you don't know everything." "What?" These were harsh words. Joseph swallowed hard. Normally he would have argued back, but maybe they were right. Bishop Hostetler had talked about Hochmut, and Miriam had said something about pride too. "You know, Joseph," Peggy went on, "I've got this agenda, and above every day there's a quote. I just read the one for today. Here it is." She opened her agenda and pushed it to Joseph. Joseph looked at it. "A proud heart and a lofty mountain are always barren." Joseph stared at it and read it again, and the words hit him like a millstone. The meaning was clear, and it was a beautiful quote. But could it be that there was a double meaning? Was there a connection between his pride and him being barren? Was he too like a lofty mountain? He was righteous and strong. Everybody thought he was a good man. But he was proud, empty, and cold, and barren. Don't end up alone, little brother. Jonathan spoke softly as he placed his hands on Joseph's arm. Miriam needs you even more now that she's pregnant. Peggy grabbed her pack of cigarettes and shook her head. I don't understand why you, of all people, doubt that God could answer your prayer. As she lit one of her Marlboros and blew out a big cloud of smoke, she peered at Joseph's face. He just stared in his cereal again. He felt smaller than the pieces of oatmeal he was moving around in his bowl and did not dare to look up. And, Peggy went on, if God didn't answer your prayer and you are still impotent, you still need to love your wife. Tears pricked Joseph's eyes and fell into his cereal and quickly merged with the milk and oats. As in a flash of revelation, he saw himself standing before an almighty God. He was even smaller than a flea. He thought again of the hymn Miriam had been singing on that day, that she claimed was the day God performed a miracle. Unworthy, unworthy, a beggar, in bondage and alone. But he made me worthy, and now by his grace, his mercy has made me his own. He truly was unworthy. Not in words, not in doctrine, and not because that was what he was supposed to be. He was truly and utterly unworthy. How proud and arrogant he had been. Everything in his life had always been about him and how he wanted his life to be. He had always claimed he served God, but in reality he had just been using God in order to serve himself. Bishop Hostetler had known, but he had not been ready to receive the truth. Joseph's thoughts drifted off to his dream again. The door to the chapel and Miriam in his nightmare had been closed. He couldn't enter it because he didn't have the right axe handles, but now he understood. He could not open a door in his own strength. Grace opened the door, grace and humility. He felt Jonathan's hand on his shoulder. Joseph, we need to go to work. You are welcome to stay, but... He stopped for a moment. I think you need to go back to Miriam as soon as you can. Joseph looked up. Comfortable warmth flushed through his body. Thank you, brother. That's the best thing I've heard in a long time. Chapter 9. Miracle Child. Forgiveness is the fragrance the flower sheds on the heel that crushed it. I don't know what came over me, Miriam. I spoiled what should have been one of our happiest moments with my inflated pride. Joseph stood in their living room and just stared at the ground while he was holding his hat in his hand. I have been proud and arrogant, and I have not been a good husband to you. Oh, Joseph, Miriam cried out. She ran over to Joseph and threw her arms around his neck. I have prayed for you so much. I don't want to live life without you. She gently wiped a strand of Joseph's hair out of his face. Look at me, Joseph. Joseph raised his eyes. He could no longer hold back his tears. Now I understand it all, Miriam. God showed me how wrong I've been. Will you forgive me? Of course, Joseph. Miriam planted a kiss on his forehead. I love you. Last night, I had a nightmare, and this morning when I was talking to Jonathan and Peggy, it all came together. I want to change my ways. It sounds strange, but I think for the first time I truly understand what it means to be Amish. Miriam could not hold back her tears anymore either. We have a child together, Joseph. A miracle child. Joseph nodded. God's way is so much better than mine, Miriam. If he would have answered in my way, you would now have had 2 babies to take care of. One in your womb and one big, inflated, arrogant baby by the name of Joseph. Miriam burst out laughing and touched Joseph's nose with her finger. Come on, Joseph. It's not that bad. We are all learning. Joseph pressed his lips together and wiped his tears away. It was that bad Miriam. But by God's grace, we will start a whole new chapter in our lives. A chapter with a baby. Miriam nodded. I was thinking, Joseph. If you want, we can go back to Dr. Morris. We can still do another test. I have a feeling the result will be different. But Joseph shook his head. No, Miriam. This is all God's doing. If He wants to bless us with children, He will, and if He doesn't, we will, and if He doesn't, we will still trust Him. We will follow Gott, and that has nothing to do with Dr. Morris and his tests. We'll only go to see him for baby checkups. Both you and the baby seem in excellent shape, Mrs. Byler. Dr. Morris smiled. He shook his head and glanced at Joseph while a small smile was painted on his face. I don't know how you did it, Mr. Byler. I am not much of a believer, but I would almost call this baby a miracle. Joseph pursed his lips and placed his arm around Miriam. It is, Doctor. God is at work in more ways than one. In only a month, we have use for the baby room. Dr. Morris rearranged some papers and said, I understand you'll have the baby at home? That's right. Miriam was beaming. Our community is blessed with an excellent midwife. Plus the hospital is too far away to reach with a buggy when my labor starts. Then I wish you a happy delivery. Or, as you would say, he said with a twinkle in his eyes, a blessed delivery. Thank you, Dr. Morris. Happy Christmas. Happy Christmas, Mr. and Mrs. Byler, the doctor said as he led the couple out of his office. Joseph's face was beaming as he held Miriam's hand. This will be our last Christmas with just the two of us. Miriam nodded. They had gone to Dr. Morris for a last check, and Miriam was grateful all was well. She buttoned up her cape. It would be a cold ride back to their farm as the first snow had started to fall. The cold wind whipped in their faces as they stepped into the street, and a small layer of snow had formed on their buggy. Joseph shivered as he carefully helped Miriam up into the buggy. We'll have a white Christmas this year, he said as he climbed up himself. He gave Miriam a gentle kiss, and Miriam snuggled up to him. God is Gott, Joseph. Very Gott. Joseph, very Gott. Joseph smiled. We should be home just before dark. Then he pulled on the reins of their old horse, Rainbow. Come on, Rainbow. Giddy up. The horse started to move and led the happy couple out of town. Chapter 10. The Valley of the Shadow. The diamond cannot be polished without friction, nor man perfected without trials. It was later than expected and already dark as they came closer to their farm. Only a mile to go, and then they could rest. As they took a turn off the main road and entered the small wood path to their home, Joseph flared his nostrils and looked at Miriam, who was dozing off against his shoulders. You smell that? Huh. Smell what? Joseph sniffed again. I smell burned wood and smoke. Miriam sat up straight. I only smell fir trees, she said, yawning. But then her face wrinkled into a frown. No, you're right. I smell smoke, too. What could that be? Joseph's heart skipped a beat as he guided the buggy onward. When they came to a bend in the road, they noticed the dark shadow of another buggy parked by the side of the road. As they came closer, the horse started to whinny. An older Amish man, with a long beard, stuck out his head. Bishop Hostetler. What are you doing here? He couldn't hear the bishop's answer, so he jumped off the buggy and walked towards the bishop. The bishop was sitting in his buggy and had wrapped himself in a quilt to keep warm. Even though Joseph could barely see his face, he could sense the old man was troubled. Joseph stopped their buggy and jumped off. Why are you here, Bishop? The bishop looked somber and shook his head. I have been waiting here for you, Joseph. I am so sorry. What's the matter? Joseph felt rooted to the ground. There was a fire, the bishop said with a tired voice. We did what we could. A fire, Joseph interrupted him. How? Where? Abe Zook saw it first. He warned us, but we were too late to save your barn. Joseph stared at the bishop. Our barn? What do you mean you couldn't save it? It's gone, Joseph. It has burned down to the ground. Burned down. And what about the horses? Bishop Hostetler scratched his head. We could save the donkeys, but not your 2 horses. Joseph blinked his eyes and the world started to turn under his feet. He needed support and grabbed the bishop's buggy to steady himself. We are ruined. And the rest of the farm? Joseph clutched the despondent old man's arm. Most of it is fine, the bishop answered. We couldn't save the newly constructed baby room, but the rest of the farm is fine. My baby room is gone too. How did the fire start? The bishop shook his head. Who knows? Maybe you left an oil lamp burning and the cat knocked it over. It's hard to tell. The bishop shivered. It was bad, Joseph. There was little we could do. But we got everyone together and we all desperately prayed, and then the bishop's eyes lit up. The winds changed. It was truly miraculous, as the flames were blown away from the rest of your farm just on time. I'm sure the snow helped as well. Joseph? Miriam's voice penetrated through the cold evening air. Is everything all right? I am coming, Miriam, he called back. Joseph looked into the eyes of his bishop. Thank you, Mr. Hostetler. Please go home now, as it is way too cold for you here. The bishop nodded. We're all behind you, Joseph. Whatever you need, we will work it out. Then the bishop spurred his horse into action and turned around. God be with you, Joseph. And with you, Bishop. Joseph stared at the bishop's buggy disappearing and walked over to their own buggy. What was that all about? Miriam asked when Joseph climbed back up. He stared at the floor and said nothing. Then he looked into Miriam's eyes. Miriam, there's been a fire. Miriam's face turned pale. A fire. Joseph nodded. The horses are dead and the baby room is ruined. Although the fig tree shall not blossom, neither shall fruit be in the vines. The labor of the olive shall fail, and the fields shall yield no meat. The flock shall be cut off from the fold, and there shall be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will joy in the God of my salvation. Whether it was the shock of seeing the burned-down barn, the sight of the smoldering remains of Joseph's beautiful baby room, or just the tiredness and the cold, Joseph couldn't tell, but as soon as Miriam climbed down from their buggy and saw what was left of their beautiful farm, she screamed in pain. Miriam, what's wrong? Miriam leaned against their buggy and was panting. Dee don't know, Joseph. There's this terrible sharp pain that went through my body. I never had this before. Let's go inside, Miriam. Joseph supported his wife and gently led her inside the farm. He placed her in an easy chair near the hearth. I'll make a fire. Just don't move, Miriam. J. Joseph. Miriam looked pale and her voice sounded weak and strained. I am bleeding. You're what? Gott. This can't be happening. Joseph started to shake. There's something wrong with the baby. Miriam was panting. It hurts, Joseph. This pain is cutting through me like a knife. What can I do, Miriam?" "Pray for me, Joseph." Miriam looked up at him with pleading eyes. "Pour out your heart before Gott for us." Joseph fell on his knees before Miriam in their cold living room and placed his hands on Miriam's lap. "Oh, dear Heavenly Father, God of our life, you must help us. Darkness has covered us, and there's no light to be seen. We are your children. Walk with us as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death." And Joseph prayed and prayed some more. He stormed the gates of heaven on behalf of Miriam and their soon-to-come son. Even the loss of their barn, the 2 horses, and the baby room didn't matter to him. Nothing mattered except beautiful Miriam and their precious child. And as Joseph fervently poured out his heart before the throne of God, a deep sense of peace settled on their weary hearts. Miriam squeezed Joseph's hands. "The sharp pains have stopped, Joseph." Joseph opened his eyes and with a smile wiped some tears from his face. "What would we do without prayer, Miriam?" Miriam touched Joseph's cheek and stroked his beard. "You are a precious man, Joseph." For a moment, they sat still in each other's presence and basked in the assurance that God was with them. Then she rubbed her tummy. "Would you help me to get in bed, Joseph? I feel so tired now." Within minutes, Joseph had helped Miriam to her bed, and after he had prepared her some hearty broth, he blew out the oil lamp in their room. He still needed to take care of the horse and look after the 2 donkeys. But as long as Miriam was safe, all would be fine, and in spite of the disastrous ending of this day, there was a song in Joseph's heart, and as he went to work, he started to sing. "My times are in my Savior's hand. Nail pierced upon the cross for me, and he will lead me to that land where I with him shall ever be." Chapter 11. As shepherds watch their flocks, to stand in the midst of darkness and behave as if all is light, that is victory. "Good morning, Miriam." Joseph stood at the foot of the bed and held a tray with a delicious breakfast in his hands. Miriam opened her eyes and tried to smile, but she still looked very tired and was a bit pale. Everything was not as it should be. "Miriam?" he asked while he put the tray down on the bedside table. "Are you all right?" "I am still bleeding a little bit, Joseph." She blinked her eyes. "Do you still have those sharp pains?" Miriam shook her head. "Not much, but I was thinking we might need some help." "Do you want me to call the Zooks?" Miriam shook her head. "No, Joseph. I was thinking it would be better to go to the hospital. Gott will take care of us, but we need to do what we can do, and then Gott will do what we can, remember?" Joseph couldn't help but smile. "You mean roll away the stone?" Miriam nodded. "Yes, now's the time to roll away the stone, Joseph." "But how?" Joseph scratched his head. "The hospital is far away. 2 of our horses are dead, and Rainbow can't make another trip with his arthritis. We've got the donkeys, Joseph." "The donkeys?" Miriam cast him a weak smile. "Prepare the donkeys, Joseph." "You're sure, Miriam? The hospital is a long ride, and it's cold. It's been snowing all night, and the roads are hard to travel. Remember what the bishop said the other day?" "What?" Joseph sighed. "When the going gets tough, the tough get going. And that's what we are going to do." The bitter cold was biting Joseph's face as he steered the buggy over the small country roads in the direction of the hospital. He had pulled his hat tightly over his head and wrapped himself in a blanket. He peered into the distance. Traveling was slow. The donkeys couldn't go any faster because of the heavy snow, but they were making progress. The gray winter sky was darkened by heavy clouds, and Joseph suspected more snow would fall. Only a few more hours, and then the daylight would fade into the dark of night. Hopefully, they would be in the hospital by then. At least Miriam did not seem to have any more of these alarming pains, and she had not been complaining about the bleeding anymore either. She was sleeping in the back. Joseph had made a bed for her and piled several heavy quilts on top of her. In spite of the cold, she would be warm. As Joseph directed the buggy over a hill, he noticed a small town in the valley below. They were coming closer. This town was only a few miles away from the hospital. Then it happened. The sound of breaking wood cut through the stillness of the winter air, and the buggy instantly tilted to the left. Ho! Stop, donkeys! Hoo! Joseph ordered the animals to a halt and jumped off the buggy. What had happened? It was easy to see. The rear wheel on the left had cracked. There was no way they could travel on without replacing the wheel. Joseph stared at it and shook his head. His brother Jonathan had once said that problems usually do not come alone, but in bunches. It was apparently a true saying. What happened, Joseph? Miriam woke up and called out to him. Joseph sighed. The wheel's broken. The wheel is broken. What do we do now? Joseph paced back and forth. Don't know, Miriam. I really don't know. Gott. This is too much. Joseph, Miriam's voice was calm. We must trust even now. For a moment, Joseph felt tempted to scream, but he knew Miriam was right, and he marveled at her faith. It was true. God would not abandon them. Do you have any trouble? A raspy voice startled Joseph. He turned around and looked in the unshaven face of an older man with a wrinkled face and long strands of hair that came out from under his fur cap. He peered with gentle brown eyes at Joseph and grinned a toothless smile. His small shepherd dog was sniffing at Joseph's pants. Joseph nodded. Yeah, our wheel's broken. I see, the man answered while he took off his cap and scratched his scraggly hair. Joseph sighed. My wife is pregnant. She's having some problems and we wanted to go to the hospital. I see, the man answered. Then he stretched out his hand. Name is Farmer. Joseph shook his hand. Joseph Byler. You're Amish. Joseph nodded. Where are you staying tonight? Farmer asked. Joseph shrugged his shoulders. I wanted to go to the hospital and sleep there, but now I don't know. You can stay in Billy's Inn, Farmer suggested as he pointed to town. It's the only thing in town. He shook the snow off his coat. How's your wife? Will she be all right? Yes, I'll be fine, Mr. Farmer. Miriam spoke from the broken buggy and smiled a weak smile. Farmer pressed his lips together as he stared at Miriam. God bless you, ma'am. Sorry to hear you're having trouble. Miriam sucked in her lips. We just have to trust in Gott. Farmer thought for a while. Then he looked at Joseph. Tell you what. You two go to Billy's Inn, and I'll fix that wagon of yours. My friends and I are shepherds, but we know a thing or two about carpentry, and then you'll be on your way tomorrow to the hospital. Joseph didn't know what to say, and walked over to Miriam. He lowered his voice and said, What do you think, sweetheart? Do you think it is safe to leave our belongings in this man's hands? Miriam pondered the proposal. I've been resting most of the trip and feel much better. Besides, we don't have much of an alternative, do we? Maybe he's Gott's answer. Joseph nodded. We'll take one of the donkeys and leave the other one with Mr. Farmer so he can easily pull the buggy back to us tomorrow. He turned back to Farmer. It's a good deal, Mr. Farmer. We are grateful. How much do we owe you? Farmer beamed. Nothing, of course. It's Christmas Eve, folks. It's the night of our Savior. Can't a man do a good deed anymore without being paid? When you come to Billy's Inn, tell them Eli's Inn, tell them Eleazar Farmer sent you. Everyone here knows me. He walked over to the buggy and extended his hand to Miriam. Mom, allow me to help you down. Only minutes later, Joseph had loosened one of the donkeys and carefully helped Miriam on top of its back. Farmer shook his head and said in his raspy voice, a pregnant woman on a donkey with her Joseph looking for a place to sleep. And that on Christmas Eve. Despite the trouble, Joseph had to smile. God certainly did seem to have a sense for drama. Bye, Mr. Farmer. We'll meet you tomorrow at Billy's Inn. Chapter 12, Holy Night. He washed my eyes with tears that I might see. But Billy's Inn was closed. Joseph had found the place without difficulty, as it was located in the middle of the only street the town possessed. But the lights were out, the blinds shut, and instead of warm Christmas lights and sweet carols coming from the tavern, there was nothing but wind, snow, and ice. A small statue of a wooden Santa had been pushed over by the wind and lay now prostrate in the snow as if it was worshipping the newborn king. There was a sign on the door. As Joseph read it, he just shook his head. Happy Christmas, everyone. We'll be back next year. Apparently, Eleazar Farmer hadn't been in town for some time. What now? Joseph looked grim as he surveyed the deserted street. Where could they go? He stomped the snow off his shoes and looked up to the heavens as the darkness was settling in. They would need help soon. Joseph. Miriam's voice sounded weak. Are you cold, sweetheart? No, Joseph. It's not that. I think I have lost my water. Joseph's heart started to race. What? No, Miriam, that can't be. Miriam let out a weary sigh. The baby is coming, Joseph. For a moment, Joseph stared at Miriam, who was slouched on the donkey and then ran to the first house he saw and rang the bell. It was as dark as the inn. Nobody came. This town was no more than a ghost town. But he had to find help, and while he whispered a prayer, he ran to the next house and pounded on the heavy oak door. For a moment, nothing happened, but just as Joseph wanted to turn, he heard some shuffling inside the house. Somebody hollered, "Who's there?" Thank God, somebody's home. We need help, Joseph yelled. My wife is having a baby, but we have no sleeping place. For a moment, it was still. Then a heavy door latch was removed, and the door opened a crack. Two eyes stared at Joseph. Please, sir. Joseph's voice was strained. We came for the inn, but it's closed. My wife is about to give birth. Do you know where we could stay the night? Now the door opened all the way. A broad-shouldered man appeared. His suspenders were stretched over his belly, and his head was covered with a red Santa hat. This is Christmas Eve, man. Not quite the time to be knocking on doors, is it? But he didn't sound unfriendly. Joseph sighed. No, sir. I am sorry. Where's your wife? The man asked. Joseph pointed to the donkey that was still parked before the inn. The man stuck his head out the door and glanced at Miriam. Then he shook his head. You folks must be crazy to travel through the snow on a donkey at Christmas time. Wait here." He closed the door with a bang. But 2 minutes later it opened again, and the man appeared again, now dressed in a ski jacket. "Come with me," he ordered. "You can stay in my converted barn. It's behind my house. It's not much of anything, but it's warm and dry, and there is place for your donkey as well. And—" he narrowed his eyes just for one night. In a clumsy effort to thank the man, Joseph grabbed the man's hand and started to shake it. "Thank you, sir." "God bless you. How can I repay you?" "Amish." "Huh." The man smiled. "Just keep us in your prayers. I'll consider that payment enough." A few minutes later, Joseph had led Miriam into their newfound shelter. The man lit an oil lamp, and the light cast big shadows on the rough stone floor. It couldn't be more than 10 feet by 10, but it was big enough. One wall was taken up by a rough wooden bed, and a small hearth adorned the opposite wall. Joseph would have to lie on the ground. "I'll get you some wood for the fire," the man said. "You can put the donkey there." He pointed to a big opening in the wall that led to a part of the barn that still served as a stable. "By the way, my name is Brady Brannan. My wife will bring you some bread, milk, and blankets." Then he eyed Miriam, who sat down on the bed. "Your wife's very pregnant, isn't she? You sure the baby's coming tonight?" Joseph nodded. "She just lost her water." Brannan nodded. Know what to do. Miriam had not said much yet, but now looked up with a painful smile. "We trust in Gott, Mr. Brannan. Gott will help us. The contractions are getting stronger now." Brannan shook his head. "This is one of the strangest Christmas Eves I've ever seen." Then he broke out into a wide smile and turned again to Joseph. "Just last night, my wife asked me to put a big Christmas star on the roof of this stable. You know, for decoration. I thought it was a waste, but I will light that thing right away." He stopped in the door opening and shook his head again. "One more thing. My wife. She's a qualified midwife. Just thought you would like to know." Then he walked off in a hurry, and Joseph could hear him hum, "Oh, holy night. The stars are brightly shining." 4 hours later, Joshua Emmanuel Byler was born. With a hearty cry, he announced his arrival. Born in a converted stable by the heat of an open fire and surrounded by an invisible host of angels, Joshua Emmanuel, the miracle child of Joseph and Miriam Byler, entered the world. Joseph had no idea what he was supposed to do, and was ever so thankful that God had led them to the only place in the whole area with a midwife who knew what to do. But Brannan's wife hardly had any work, as there were no complications and everything went unusually smooth for a first delivery. The only time Joseph squirmed was when Brannan's wife cut the umbilical cord. His eyes became big, and he started to breathe heavily and steadied himself against the wall of the stable. Miriam had almost burst out laughing, but Joseph wrinkled his nose and pretended he knew what was going on. "It's a beautiful Christmas child," Brannan's wife had announced, "and it's a healthy 8-pound baby." After she had washed the baby, she placed it in Miriam's arms, and Joseph looked in awe at his own child. He remembered the baby of his sister Abigail, so many years ago, that had kindled that deep desire for a child of his own. Tears pricked his eyes as he lifted his heart in worship to the Savior. It had been a difficult road that had lasted several years, but that journey was over. God had made them fruitful in spite of the many obstacles along the way. Only a few hours prior, a dark voice had whispered to him that their baby would be born in the snow, and both baby and Miriam would suffer and die. It had been the voice of the tempter, but Joseph had resisted it. He knew God's voice well enough by now to know that this was not the voice of his precious Savior, and had refused to listen to it. As he glanced at his beautiful wife and the precious bundle clutched to her breast, warm tears rolled out of his eyes. He wouldn't get much sleep this night, but he felt he was standing on holy ground and didn't want to miss even a minute of the wonder before his eyes. Chapter 13. 3 Kings. They that bear the cross shall wear the crown. The next morning, Brannon knocked and entered the stable. Eleazar Farmer is here to see you. He brought some friends. Can they come in? Of course, Miriam smiled. We are so grateful to all you good people. The grinning face of Eleazar appeared in the door opening, and he was followed by 3 of his friends that were dressed in similar fashion. Big boots, rough woolen sweaters, and leather overcoats. I see you have no more need of the hospital, Eleazar said with a twinkle in his eyes as he beheld the baby. Then he turned to introduce his friends. Meet my colleagues. We worked on your buggy till late in the evening. It's all fixed, and you can be on your way as soon as you need to. It's our Christmas present. He walked over to Miriam and knelt before the bed. What a lovely baby this is. A gentle smile washed over his face, a true Christmas child. Miriam nodded. It sure is Mr. Farmer. Would you like to hold him for a moment? Miriam raised herself up and held out little Joshua Emmanuel. Oh, no. Moo, Mrs. Farmer moved back. I am just an old shepherd and... He pointed at his clothes, not very clean. Nonsense, Miriam said. You are a gut man. I'm sure Joshua won't mind. Farmer respectfully lifted the bundle out of Miriam's arms as his eyes grew wide. Beautiful, he whispered. It's like holding a bit of heaven in my hands. Then one of Farmer's friends started to sing a Christmas hymn, and soon the others joined in. Bow thine ear, in mercy bow. Hear the world's atonement, thou. Jesus, in thy name we pray. Take our sins away. Life was not easy for Joseph and Miriam after they came back to their farm. The loss of the 2 good horses, their barn and baby room, was an enormous blow to their finances, and although the community helped them in any way they could, the couple passed through a deep valley. But whenever Joseph felt tempted to get discouraged, all he had to do was take a look at the rosy cheeks of Joshua Emmanuel. Just seeing the little fellow and knowing what miracles God had done to get him here was enough to flood his heart with faith. We hold on by faith, Miriam said. Life may be tough today, but we've got a heavenly Father who knows how to care for his children. We are perfectly safe. And so it was that morning, 1 month after the birth, that Joseph was looking out over the fields near his home when he saw 3 shiny black cars driving up the road. 3 cars. Who was coming to see them? Miriam, he called out. We've got visitors. Joshua was sleeping and Miriam joined her husband outside to look at the approaching cars. They looked fancy and official. What could that be, Joseph? Miriam asked. Joseph shrugged. I really don't know. The cars came to a halt right before the front door of their farm, and 3 men in suits and ties stepped out. Mr. and Mrs. Byler questioned an older-looking gentleman with wavy gray hair that was neatly held in place with gel stuck out his hand. Joseph nodded. Yes, sir. What can we do for you? Well, the man smiled. My name is Lyndon King. Then he turned to his companions. We are attorneys and work for the governors of the local district. We have something to share with you. Can we come in, perhaps?" Of course, Joseph felt uneasy. Are we in any sort of trouble? On the contrary, Mr. Byler, but let's talk inside. Perhaps you have some of your famous Amish coffee for us? And a piece of rhubarb pie, maybe, added another smaller man with bone-rimmed glasses. Certainly, Miriam said. Please come in. $5,000? Joseph scratched his forehead. You are rewarding us with $5,000? That's right, Mr. Byler, King said as he slurped his coffee. As I said, it is the custom in our area that every child born on Christmas Eve is eligible to participate in a lottery. The names of all babies born on that special day are put in a hat, and the winner gets the first prize. He cut a piece off his rhubarb pie with his spoon and looked up with a grand smile. The winner was a certain Joshua Emmanuel Byler. You know who that is? Joseph swallowed hard and grabbed Miriam's arm for support. Yes, sir. That's our son. Then, the third man said as he put down his coffee mug, It is my duty to hand you this check. With a swift move, he pulled a check out of his coat pocket and placed it before Joshua's astonished face. King and his other associates smiled and nodded their heads in agreement. Joseph stared at the check and looked up into Mr. King's face. Is this for real? Lyndon nodded. As real as your baby, Mr. Byler. Then he looked at his watch and said, Good luck with your Christmas, child. Now if you'll excuse us, we have other visits to make. He got up and buttoned up his long overcoat. He still licked a crumb from his lips. Nice pie that was. He turned to his companions. Gentlemen, let's go. He tipped his hat, ma'am, sir. A good day to you. Then he stepped out, and the others followed him. Joseph's mouth hung open. Miriam, what just happened? Miriam just smiled. Who is like unto our Gott, Joseph? We've got nothing to fear. Glory be to God on high. Chapter 14, Epilogue. Faith is not surprised at the answer. Faith expected it to happen. Dr. Al Morris scratched the bald spot on his head again and read the test results for the third time. It really said what it said, but how was that possible? Finally, he looked up at the couple that was sitting before him and shook his head. The woman was holding a baby on her lap and was playing with the baby's arm. The child was squealing with delight. Shh, Sarah. The woman said, We need to be quiet. The good doctor wants to tell us something. Dr. Morris cleared his throat. Mr. and Mrs. Byler, I know you didn't really want to take this test, but because I was so insistent, you did take it. He looked at Joseph Byler and shook his head. However, the results are not what I expected. How many children do you have now? The doctor already knew the answer, but just wanted to hear it again straight from Joseph. 6, doctor. Joshua Emmanuel is now 8 and little Sarah, as you know, is 6 months. Dr. Morris pursed his lips. Well, he was clearly uncomfortable with the test's results in his hand. I always have been a man of science, and as such, I don't believe in miracles. But your family, Mr. Byler, he looked again at his paper, is a clear miracle, I confess. Joseph Byler raised his eyebrows. Why is that, doctor? Because the doctor says your fertility test is conclusive and clear. He turned the test results to Joseph and pointed to the last line that he had marked in red. It read, Conclusion. Mr. Joseph Abraham Byler, husband to Miriam Sarah Byler, will never be able to produce proper offspring. And you, Dr. Morris, continued with a weary smile. Have 6. How is that possible? Miriam radiated with an unearthly beauty. Just have faith, Doctor. God does what he wants. Whether or not he simply lifts my husband's infertility at times, or he does it another way, I don't know, but I do know I have never known another man beside Joseph, and we've got 6 children. Joseph nodded and beamed a smile as well. Doctor, you just have to roll the stone away. Make room for the miracle, and God will do what you can't. Dr. Morris frowned. What do you mean, Mr. Byler? Do you have time on Sunday, Doctor? Joseph grinned. Why? I have been asked to deliver the sermon this Sunday. My sermon is called Miracles and Other Wonders. The end. Thank you for listening. Here at PureRead, we aim to serve you, our dear readers and listeners, with good, clean Christian stories. You can be assured that any PureRead book you pick up will not only be hugely enjoyable, but free of any objectionable content. We are deeply thankful to you for choosing our books. Your support means that we can continue to provide stories like the one you have just listened to. To browse our range of clean and wholesome titles, go to pureread.com. Please like and subscribe to our channel. That way you'll be the first to hear when new stories arrive here for your enjoyment. God bless you, and thank you again for listening.